Cui Meng, in other words, Cui Meng, son of a large family in Zhangchangfu, has a resolute temperament. As a child in private school, he punched his classmates when they offended him slightly. Sir, he's been persuaded repeatedly, and he's still on. His name and words are all gentlemen's, and that's what it means to persuade him not to be too tough. Up to the age of 16 or 17, Cui Meng was even more bravura and had a master's skill. He could use a long stick and fly over the ridge in his room. He was a man of deep indignation, so he was admired by people from all over the country, and the courtyard was full of people who had approached him to complain. Cui Mengi is not afraid of getting revenge when he is in a position to help the weak. The bad guys broke him a little bit, and he hit them with rocks, hit them with sticks, broke their legs and broke their arms. When he's angry, he doesn't dare talk, but he has the greatest respect for his mother, who disappears when she arrives, no matter how angry she is. His mother was the harshest and often harshest disciplinarian, taking orders but forgetting when he left. Choi's neighbor had a fierce mother-in-law who abused her every day. The mother-in-law is starving, and the son gives her a little food in secret. The mother-in-law knows. She hurls insults and makes her neighbors nervous. In a fit of rage, Choi climbed over the wall and cut off the woman's ears, nose, lips, and tongue before she died. After Cui Mu heard about it, she was shocked, and summoned the wife's husband in a hurry, tried to console her, and offered him as his wife, a young slave. For that, Miss Choi wept bitterly and skipped meals. Terrified, Choi kneeled to the ground and asked her mother to punish her, saying she had regretted it. The mother just cried and did not answer him. After Choi's wife, Zhou Shi, kneeled on the ground to ask for mercy, Choi beat her son with the cane, stabbed him with the cross with a needle, and painted a red color on his arm so as not to ruin him. Miss Choi accepted it before her mother started eating. Choi usually likes monks and priests of Bushi Huayan, and often makes them eat. Once, a Taoist priest came to the door. Cui Meng walked by, and Taoist counselor detailed him, saying, "Your face is full of ferocity, and I'm afraid it will not end well. You, virtuous people shouldn't be." Cui Meng had just been instructed by his mother to listen to the Taoist priest and to rise up and say, "I know that too, but I can't help myself when I see something that is not right with me. I try to fix it. Can I avoid disaster? Don't ask if it's inevitable. Ask yourself if you can change it," the Theshik said with a laugh. "If you change your ways, even if there's 1 in 10,000 hope, I'll tell you a way out of this death disaster." Cui Meng Pyong was the last person to believe in the Taoist magic, so he listened to the Taoist word and laughed. "I knew you didn't believe me, but I'm not talking about magic like witches do," the Taoist priest said. "If you do, it's Jade's business. If it doesn't work, it doesn't bother you." Choi asked Taoist priests for advice. The Taoist said, "There is a young man outside the house, and you should make a life and death relationship with him. In the future, even if you commit a capital crime, he can save you. When you're done, get Choi out of the house and show him the young man." It turns out that man is Zhao's child, named Monk. Zhao, originally a native of Nanshan, led his son to Jiancheng because of the disaster. Since then, Cui Meng has made efforts to get monks to meet and ask Zhao to set up a museum in his home, and has been treated very well. The 12-year-old monk became a brother to Choi after meeting his mother. After more than a year, Zhao led his son back to his hometown. The audio was cut off. Miss Choi's son has been under stricter control since the death of the neighbor's mother-in-law. If anyone tells you anything, she'll be thrown out. One day, Miss Choi's younger brother died, and Mr. Choi followed her to her funeral. There were a few people on the way. A man was tied up in a rope, and they beat and scolded him, urging him to leave. Onlookers jammed the road and Miss Choi's car couldn't get through. Mr. Choi asked passers-by what was going on. At this point, someone who knew him was rushing to tell him the truth. Turns out, there's a big-time official on the side, and no one dares to mess with him. It is a rare glimpse of Mr. Li's wife's beauty and an attempt to grab it, but there is no excuse. He told his family to lure Mr. Li into gambling, lent him loan sharks, mortgaged his wife, and wrote down his handwriting. After Li Xin lost, he lent him money. Li Xin gambled all night and lost a lot of money. Half a year later, with interest, I'm 30 years short of that evil. Li Xin couldn't make it. The evil sentinel sent his paws to rob his wife. Li Shen went to the gate of the evil few and cried bitterly. The evil few was furious. He tied Li Shenla to a tree and beat him severely, forcing him to show no remorse. When Choi hears this, he pushes his chest, whips his horse, and he's about to rush up. His mother hurriedly pulled the curtains open and said, "Stop it." "What's the problem?" Mr. Cui had to stop. When he returned home from his funeral, Mr. Cui did not speak or eat, but sat, his eyes straight, as if he were vomiting with someone. His wife asked him, and she didn't answer. At night, he lay in bed with his clothes on, tossing and turning until dawn. The next night, again, he then suddenly got up and left bed, opened the door, and walked out. Later came back to lie down, causing a hail of pain 3 or 4 times. His wife wouldn't dare ask him, just hold his breath and listen to his movements. In the end, he went out for a long time before returning, closed his door, and went to bed. That night, the villain was killed in the bed, disemboweled, and his intestines flowed out. Li Xin's wife was also killed naked under the bed. The government suspects that Mr. Li was behind the attack, and he was arrested and tortured, revealing his ankle bones. After more than a year of torture, Mr. Li was sentenced to death. At that point, Tram died. After burying his mother, Mr. Cui told his wife, "It's me who killed the little one. I was afraid to admit it because my mother was here. How can I make someone else suffer for my sins when my mother's death is over? I'm going to the capital to die." His wife listened, pulled his clothes in surprise, and Mr. Cui waved and broke off his wife, and turned himself into the government. After hearing what had happened to him, the government was taken aback and immediately put on his weapon. He was jailed and released. Li Xin did not leave, and he made it clear that he had killed himself. The government too cannot say, and they both go to prison. The relatives of Mr. Li Shen all ridiculed Mr. Li for being too stupid, saying, "What Mr. Cui did is exactly what I wanted to do, but couldn't do it. He did it for me. How can I watch him die? Let's say he didn't turn himself in today. I'm sure I killed someone and fought with Cui Meng for his life." After a long period of time, the people in the Yamen knew the truth of the matter, forced Li Shen out, sentenced Cui Meng to death, and were about to be executed. Just in time for the criminal division's Zhao Bulong to patrol Jianchang. He saw Mr. Cui's name when he was arraigning a death row case, told his entourage to leave, and then called him up. Cui Meng came in and looked up at the lobby. It turned out that Zhao Bulong was Zhao San. Choi Mong Wook, and his happiness, tell the truth about what happened. After much deliberation, Zhao told Cui to return to prison, and told the warden to take good care of him. Soon after, Cui Meng turned himself in and commuted his crimes to Yunnan province. Li Xin volunteered to follow him and serve his sentence. Within a year, Mr. Cui had returned home with the customary pardon. That's all Mr. Zhao has done. After Mr. Li returned from Yunnan, he lived with Mr. Cui and cared for him. He doesn't want to work for Choi, but he's interested in martial arts like walkways, knives, and sticks. Choi treated him graciously, bought his daughter-in-law, and gave him a farm. After this incident, Cui Meng changed his ways, and every time he stroked the cross pattern on his arm, and remembered his mother's precepts, he cried and shed tears. So when there was any more grievance in the countryside, Mr. Li always sorted it out for them in Mr. Cui's name and never told Miss Cui. There's a Mr. Wang. The family is very rich. The scoundrels who come and go in and out of his house. They robbed many of the rich people in this county. Anyone who offends them, they collude with the bandits and kill him in the wild. Mr. Wang's son is also absurd and brutal. Mr. Wang has a widowed aunt and a father and son who are both adulterers. Mr. Wang's wife, Kia Shi, strangled her with a rope after dissuading her husband several times. When the brothers sued the government, Mr. Wang paid off the officials with money, saying they were false accusers. When the Kia brothers had no way to complain, they came to Cui Meng's home to cry and complain. Li Xin listened twice and let them go. A few more days later, Mr. Cui's family came to him. When the servant was not there, Mr. Choi asked Mr. Li to make tea. Li Shenmo went out in silence and said, "I am friends with Cui Meng, and I followed him to Yunnan province. But not only has he never paid me, but I'm a servant, and I can't bear it anymore," and left furiously. Someone told Cui Meng, and Cui Meng was surprised that he suddenly changed his mind, but he didn't feel any strange. Li Xin sued Cui Meng for failing to pay him wages for 3 years. Only then did Cui Meng feel astonished and confront him in person. At the official residence, where Li Xin was furiously at odds with Cui Meng, the government dismissed Li Xin for making a scene. A few days later, Li Xin suddenly broke into Wang Jiansheng's home at night and killed Wang Jiansheng's father and son along with his aunt. He also put a note on the wall and wrote his name on it. By the time the authorities came after him, he was nowhere to be seen. The Wang family suspects that Li Xin was Cui Meng's emissary, but the government doesn't believe him. Only then did Mr. Cui realize that Mr. Li had been involved in a legal battle with himself for fear of being hurt by the killings. The Chinese government's official line is near the county. They're in urgent pursuit of Li. Soon after, just in time for Mr. Li, the breakout king, to invade Beijing, the case was put on hold. After the fall of the Ming dynasty, Li Xinkai returned with his family members and still lived with Cui Meng. It was a time of great chaos, and thieves swarmed. Wang Jiansheng has a nephew named Wang Diren, who gathered up a group of scoundrels whom his uncle had recruited to steal the mountain, kill and loot, and do nothing evil. One night, Wang Diren led the thieves into their nest and attacked the Cui family in the name of revenge. Cui Meng happened to be out of the house, and after the robber broke through the gate of Cui's home, Li Xinkai realized that he hurriedly climbed over the wall and escaped, lying in the dark. After the robbers could not find Cui Meng and Li Xin, they took Cui Meng's wife and searched all the property. When Li Xin returned, he was angry and anxious to see only one servant left in the family. He found a rope, cut it into dozens of sections, handed the short one to the servant and the long one into his arms. The servants were instructed to reach behind the robber's nest, climb up the hill, light the rope with fire, scatter the thorns in the hill, and return immediately. The servant promised. Mr. Li once saw robbers with red belts around their belts and red handkerchiefs on their hats, and he was dressed up as well. There's an old mare in the house. She just had a pony. The robbers didn't want it. They left it outside. Mr. Li tethered the horse to the door, rode his own mare, and rushed to the robber's lair. The bandits occupied a large village, and Mr. Li chained his horses outside, climbed over the wall, and touched inside. The bandits were everywhere, armed with weapons. Mr. Li asked a robber privately, knowing that Mr. Choi's wife was at Mr. Wang's. In a moment, I heard a summons for everyone to rest, and the bandits answered with a bang. At this time, someone suddenly shouted that there was a fire on the East Mountain. And the bandits looked east together, and there was a light of fire. At first, there were only 1 or 2, and it was as many as the stars in the sky. Li Xin took the plane and shouted that there were enemies on the East Hill. Wang Diren was so shaken that he rushed to the front of the crowd. Mr. Li took a flight to the back and sneaked into Mr. Wang's apartment. There were 2 robbers guarding him, and Mr. Listen hypothesized, General Wang forgot to wear a knife. The 2 robbers listened and fought to find him, and Li Xin slashed them from behind. One fell to the ground with a knife, and the other looked back, busy, when Li Xin slashed him with another knife and climbed over the wall with Cui's wife. Outside the village, Mr. Li dismantled the mare and handed the reins to Miss Cui, saying, "The lady doesn't know the way. Just let the horse run." The mother is in love, running home, and Li Xin follows. Out of the valley, Mr. Li pulled out the long rope he was carrying, lit it with fire, and hung it all over the valley before coming home. The next day, Cui Meng came back, and after hearing about this incident, he thought that he was a great disgrace. And he was furious, and he wanted to go to the house of the thief alone. And Li Shen dissuaded him, and called the people in the village together to discuss ways to deal with it. But everyone's afraid of the robbers. They don't dare to show up. Li persuaded him repeatedly to muster 20 or so men who dared to fight bandits, only to suffer without weapons. At this time, Li Shen decided that it was necessary to capture 2 of Wang Diren's informants from the family's home, and Cui Meng tried to kill them. They told the 20 or so strong men, all carrying white sticks, to line up, drag the 2 men, cut their ears off in public, and let them go. Everyone complained. We people, fearing the robbers would know the details. Now we give them the facts. If they come into their nests, the whole village will not survive. I was trying to get them here. Li Shen killed all those who harbored robbers and assaults, and sent people to borrow bows and arrows, flames, and 2 cannons from the county. In the evening, Mr. Li led the men to the barn, first laying the guns in the barn, then sending 2 men to lay in the fire, and ordering them to see the robbers arrive, and to set the guns on fire. Then he took people to the east of the pass, and he cut down a lot of trees, and piled them up on the hillside. After all the work was done, Mr. Li and Mr. Cui, each with a dozen men, were ambushed on either side of the valley. At the end of the quickness, the horses screamed from afar, and the bandits swarmed in. When the robbers went into the valley, Mr. Li was ordered to push all the trees he had cut down to the bottom, blocking the robbers' exit route. Then, the artillery roared, shouting death shook the valley. The robbers hurried back and trampled on each other. Chaos. Retreating to Gudongku, the trees blocked their way out, and the bandits crammed into an egg. At this point, the fire was perched on both sides of the valley, and the arrows were firing, like a storm. The robbers lay on their toes in a state of broken heads and upright posture, leaving only about 20 people on their knees, begging for their lives. Mr. Li sent several men to tie them up and escort them back, leading his team to the robbers' lair, where the guards fled. Li Shen seized all the robbers' zizhong, and returned with a big victory. Cui, delighted, inquired about Li Shen's rationale for setting up a rope of fire when he rescued his wife. Setting fire to the Dongshan mountain is to attract the bandits to the east, and prevent them from chasing west. Because we are retreating from the west, Mr. Li said. The rope was short and soon burned out, lest the robbers could find no one on the mountain. Finally, the fire rope is placed in the valley mouth. Because the valley mouth is narrow, one person is closed, people can't open. The bandits are chasing after, must be afraid to see the light of fire. It's all about taking the plunge, that you can't do for a while. The captured robbers were taken in for questioning, and when they chased into the valley and saw the fire in the valley, they retreated in horror. Mr. Li let the 24 robbers he captured off with their noses cut off. From there, Li Xinhuai's reputation took off. The people who are far away and close to escape from the chaos are all going for him. He made a team of more than 300 men. Bandits everywhere were afraid to invade, so the area was tranquil.
Alright, this story has come to an end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.